Welcome. I am Phineas Fisk. I'm a member of the board of Tales of Cape Cod. And I'm here tonight to introduce the speaker to you. Lisle Dalton is, I should say this, the talk should probably run 40, 45 minutes, something like that. Afterwards, we have time for questions, so get them ready. The speaker is Lisle Dalton, a professor of religious studies at Hartwick College in Oneonta, New York, where he has taught since 1999. He teaches courses in American religious history, including those that explore how religion relates to politics, popular culture, science, medicine, and technology. He currently is working on a book that will focus on religion and the American railroads. A Cape visitor since childhood, he currently splits his time between upstate New York and West Barnstable. Our subject tonight is religious freedom in colonial New England and Cape Cod. It's an overview of the social and political ideal of religious freedom as it emerged in colonial New England, with attention to trends on or near Cape Cod. It will include a discussion of the origins of religious freedom, how it was lived out in a practical sense by religious groups, and its limitations. After the talk, we will take your questions. Our sponsors tonight are Jean and Susan Gwill. Next week's program is the history of art on Cape Cod and 70 years of the Cape Cod Art Center, with Director Roberta Miller and Board President Susan Gwill presenting. So, here is our speaker, Lisle Dalton.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having me on this day when we say, Dorian wasn't as bad as we thought it was going to be. And especially I want to thank Susan and Jean for sponsoring this talk. I'm actually on sabbatical this fall, so I'm down on the Cape all fall. And so I don't get to do many lectures this year. Maybe my students are happy about this, I don't know. So I'm only going to do 2 lectures this fall. This will be one of them, and I'm going to give one at a conference later on. So I'm getting my sort of lecture impulse out. Okay, so I want to talk today about religious freedom and focus on colonial America and colonial New England in particular. But I'll talk in some more broad terms about religious freedom and some of its sources and some of its implications. I'm going to be somewhat historical, but I'll be kind of covering some things very briefly. And so certainly if I go over things that you want me to kind of go back and talk a little bit more about, I can do that. I'm going to kind of breeze over some things just because I've only got a short amount of time. And I'm also going to, again, I'm going to focus on the colonial period. So I'll look at religious freedom roughly from the early part of the 17th century through the American Revolution, although we'll go a little bit later than that because there's some important things that happen in New England in the early part of the 19th century, what we call the early national period. So I'll go from roughly, let's say, the 1630s, 1620s through about the 1830s, okay? But then hopefully I'll have some things I talk about that will have implications for other periods of time. Okay, so let me start with a little, how about a little kind of meditation on freedom. Americans are captivated by freedom and we cherish it dearly, but we sometimes don't quite agree on what it means. If you read around or listen around, you find many views. Freedom is that which challenges injustice, according to some. And then for others, freedom defends the status quo. Freedom fights for the rights of workers and labor. And for others, freedom defends the corporation from excessive regulation. Freedom protects the traditional family. Freedom expands the definition of the family. Freedom says discrimination is everywhere in every instance wrong. Freedom says an open society has the right to say some things are better, are different, and hence to be discriminated. Freedom is open to thinking about new ideas. Freedom is proud to conserve, protect, and sustain tried and true beliefs. Freedom is permeable, open to flow. Freedom protects its interests, even if this means barriers or walls. Freedom is the license of the sinner. Freedom is the virtuous choice of the saint. Okay, so freedom has varied meanings. All right, now toss in religion, which is also notoriously hard to sort of define and nail down. Generally speaking, religion is something that has multiple dimensions. It has kind of a set of beliefs or ideas, often embodied in sacred texts and things like doctrines. But it also has a physical dimension. It's practice, ritual, activities, ethical principles that are lived out. And it also has an important social dimension. Religions are organized into groups. Religious freedom can be considered the right to think and also to speak at the ideational level. So at some fundamental level, religious freedom is the right to think what you want about religion. Freedom is the right to organize around these thoughts. In general, colonial America thought about religion in terms of Christianity, in terms of Christian theology, and in particular, in terms of Protestant Christian theology. Now, there were some other things, other religious groups, or other religious ideas floating around colonial New England, but by and large, the large population, most of the people in colonial New England were Christians of various types, and most of them were probably English-derived Christians, mostly influenced by the Protestant Reformation. Okay? In colonial America, this meant Christian ideas and practices, although there were some other things. Now, one of the interesting sort of questions that's floated around religious freedom is, given the kind of a freedom of ideas, a freedom of thought about religion, are there any other limitations to it? In particular, are there limitations to actions that can be done or practices in light of those ideas? And that's oftentimes where we've seen some of the interesting discussion about religious freedom. Now, religious freedom has an important social dimension, an organizational dimension, and in some ways, religious freedom, I think, becomes most visible and interesting when there are disagreements and tensions between organized religious groups, or between organized religious groups and the government, or perhaps other powerful social interests. This might be the media, this might be business, might be education. Okay, so when there is some kind of dispute, some kind of tension between those entities. These disputes can be vast differences. They can be as serious as, for example, before the American Civil War, there was a big debate within most of the American denominations over the moral status of slavery. That's one of the enormous debates of American history. And they can be over things that are relatively small. There have been groups that have actually split up over a debate over whether or not you could use brass instruments in the worship service. Right? Okay. In some cases, the disagreements are enormous, big societal issues. Sometimes they're quite small, and they look relatively small to outsiders. So one way to think about religious organizations is to consider how comfortable and well accepted they are within society. Sometimes religious organizations are total insiders. They're supported by the government. They're supported by other social institutions. These are the mainstream religions, the standard bearers, often associated but with the classes that have some resources, with some education, social prestige. And the word we use in history and sociology to talk about these groups is low tension. They are in low tension with their socio-cultural environment. They get along. They are very comfortable with the way they are. And arguably, these groups are the main beneficiaries of religious freedom. They are sort of living out the freedom in the mainstream, oftentimes very comfortably, okay? Now, on the other hand, we have lots of other groups, interesting groups, that are on the fringe of society due to their nonconformist views, radicalism, strange practices, because they're trying to do something new and different. And oftentimes these groups are not so comfortably living in their environments. They are getting people angry at them. They are getting into disputes with other groups. Oftentimes we refer to these types of religions as being in high tension with their socio-cultural environment. Generally speaking, we categorize these groups as sectarian, or sects and cults. And in some sense, what's really interesting about religious freedom is I think these groups are perhaps even more interesting to look at than the mainstream, because oftentimes it's the edges, the fringes, where we really find a society sort of pushing the limits of religious freedom and really having deep debates about the limits of religious freedom. Of course, the government has a major role to play, and especially the legal system. Oftentimes it's to defend the mainstream or defend sort of the basic societal values, but sometimes it's also to deal with and sometimes even protect the rights of folks who are a little bit different. Okay, so that's sort of a general introduction. Now, what I want to talk about generally today is two sources, I think, of American religious freedom that were around during the colonial period, but I think maybe spill over and continue to be influential today. So I think these are older sort of, if you will, impulses or principles, but I think they're still sort of coursing through American culture to this day. And one source I'll call the rationalist source, where freedom emerges, freedom of religion emerges as diverse religions encounter each other and come to some general principles about living together. They sort of learn how to understand each other, learn how to get along. Toleration and mutual understanding become sort of essential principles for this sort of rational approach to religious freedom. And governments use these principles of toleration, of mutual understanding, as a way to sort of govern the way they do policy and the way they rule. Okay, and this is sort of one side of the religious freedom equation. The other side, which I think is equally powerful and potent and still around, is what various historians have called the pietist side. We might call this sort of coming at religious freedom from a deeply convicted religious position. And on this side, deeply religious thinkers and groups insist upon freedom to protect their particular vision of religious truth and proper practice from coercion by the government or other powerful interests. So this side of religious freedom in some sense says, you know, I've got the truth, I'm very convinced I've got the truth, and I need to protect that. And I see that government or other powerful entities or maybe other groups in the society are trying to sort of disparage that or tear that down, and I need to protect that, and therefore I need religious freedom. Okay? And in a very general sense, I think American religious freedom was built on both the rationalist and the pietist principles. But this was kind of a fitful alliance. The rationalists and the pietists really kind of come at this in two very different ways, and deep down you can kind of see that they don't necessarily agree with sort of their first principles, right? But they can come into alliance, they can kind of build a coalition around a sort of general idea that the protection of freedom, the extension of freedom is a good thing, okay? So it's a fitful alliance, often temporary, expedient, unstable. Hence, debates over religious freedom have taken many, many twists and turns. And they will continue to do that. They continue to do that right down to the present day. Okay, so in general, the early colonial history, the general history of colonial religion in the United States is one of diversity to disestablishment, which means to say that once the American colonies started getting formulated in the 17th century, they sort of built up diverse forms of religion in various different places, various different ways. And then by the time of the American Revolution, and then after the Revolution, the writing of the Constitution, and then very, very importantly, the writing of the First Amendment to the Constitution, they decided that the best policy would be a policy of disestablishment. The federal government, the national government, was not going to establish any religion over and against any other religion. And therefore it was going to guarantee also, and it was also going to guarantee the free exercise of religion. Okay, and that gets enshrined in really the central document of American religious freedom, the religion clauses of the First Amendment. Now, New England is sort of an interesting, unique case because while New England will sort of move in the same general direction as the nation, it's going to do so a little more slowly. And very interestingly enough, it is going to be interested in having one particular religion that is going to be favored by the colonial governments in various, what will eventually become the New England states. And it's going to kind of hang on to that a little longer than you might expect. This is a little counterintuitive because we kind of think of New England as being, kind of progressive and interested in separation of church and state, but it was slow. Massachusetts in particular was very slow to kind of give up its religious establishment. And it was really only until the 1830s that it was able to give that up. It was the Congregationalists that were the main favored group. And really, in some sense, they only gave it up when the other groups, some of the more minority groups in Massachusetts, finally kind of put together a coalition and kind of pressed the government to amend the state constitution to kind of give up supporting one particular religion. Okay, I'm going to go over this kind of quickly, but to give you a little background history on religious freedom, in some sense, diversity in religion has been recognized since antiquity. So if you study any ancient society or even read the biblical traditions, there's lots of encounters between different religions. And in some sense, what we find in those ancient societies, and then this stretches into the medieval world too, is a kind of different attitudes about what to do about religious diversity. One attitude is the attitude of empire, or the attitude of a society that wants to dominate all others. And it basically says, well, we'll either destroy people from the other religion or we'll make them convert to our religion. So that's been one kind of classic way that power has sort of exercised itself. Absolute power, convert all. But interestingly enough, most ancient empires were a little bit more canny, a little more flexible than that. And I'll give a kind of a paradigmatic example is the Roman Empire. The Romans were really good at conquering people, right? And they would go out and conquer various different societies, lots and lots of different religions. And the Romans would usually say, okay, we're okay if you keep your religious traditions, keep on worshiping your gods, that's fine. But in addition to worshiping your gods, worship the emperor too, worship the Roman emperor too. And very importantly, pay a little tribute through that worship to the Roman Empire, and you're okay. And, that's kind of managing, toleration, but within limits, right? And you recognize who's in power. Now, things start changing a little bit as the modern world emerges, and I'm going to go very quickly here, but the early modern period of history kind of coincides with sort of the rise of kind of modern scientific revolution, comes a little bit after the Renaissance, which is kind of a rebirth of ancient knowledge, celebration of ancient knowledge. And we also get, very importantly, the emergence of nation states based on constitutional principles, contract philosophy. A modern nation state is built on this idea of a social contract. Democratic tendencies, democratic reforms in various societies, and very importantly, a kind of an important infusion of individualism, the idea that modern peoples are going to have individual choices, and they're going to make those choices in politics, obviously, but they can also make those in all sorts of other spheres of life. And what kind of vocation do you want to pursue, and what kind of religion do you want to pursue? Okay? Commerce and industry sort of fuels this in some sense. It kind of creates the conditions under which there's more wealth, more time for people to be reflective, more education, people can read more. All right, corresponding with this also, we have in Europe a very important religious movement that leads, at least for colonial America, leads to a lot of the patterns that we see. And that is, of course, the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation is a protest movement against the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, which had largely dominated Europe throughout most of the medieval period. And so the Protestant reformers are usually people that grew up as Catholics, but then decided to depart from the Catholic tradition, came up with new ideas, different thinking, and then basically sort of led a kind of a protest movement that actually departed from the Roman Catholic Church and Roman Catholic authority. Of course, the most famous figure is Martin Luther, and the other most famous figure is a guy named John Calvin. They came up with lots of ideas, wrote a lot about how you kind of become a Reformed church. I won't go into too much of the detail, but in some sense, the Protestants are going to emphasize a different kind of theology. They're going to focus on faith. They're going to be very interested in getting everybody to read the Bible, and to do that, they start translating the Bible into the vernacular languages of Europe so that everybody can read the Bible, everybody who has literacy can read the Bible. This, in some sense, breaks the monopoly on the interpretation of the Bible, very importantly, because the Roman Catholic Church had very much tightly controlled that throughout most of the medieval period. And it kind of broke that monopoly, and all of a sudden you have all sorts of opportunities for people to kind of start rethinking Christianity based on their reading of the Bible. They established a very important theological principle called the priesthood of all believers. They kind of reject the idea of a Roman Catholic priesthood as something that kind of gets in between the believer and God. And they say what you want to do is cultivate an unmediated, direct relationship with God, through reading the scriptures, but also through direct experience. This is, in some sense, a very radical move, because in some sense it says, you need to kind of throw off authority, at least throw off traditional understandings of authority. Okay? And very importantly, Luther is kind of the key person here. They established the idea that an individual should be able to follow his or her conscience in matters of religion. When something inside your head, something moves you in a particular direction to convict you that a certain religious idea or religious value is correct, you should be able to pursue that. The freedom of conscience becomes a very important principle for the Reformation and subsequent religious movements. Okay, so the Reformation takes hold in various parts of Europe. Most important for the American story is the Reformation in Europe. This starts in the 16th century, very famously. Henry VIII wants to get a divorce, can't get it, so decides to split off from the Roman Catholic Church. He embarks on a journey in the direction of a kind of a Protestant church, but it's a Protestant church that is under the authority of the English monarch. So it's, in some sense, still got a sense of hierarchy, but it's a different sort of hierarchy because it's under the king and not under the Pope. Okay? Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, inherits this sort of tradition, and she's actually very canny politically and socially and culturally in lots of ways, and leads England into one of its greatest, most successful periods. But religiously, she's very shrewd about kind of settling down the kind of post-Reformation or the post-split that Henry had established. There was a lot of instability in England right after Henry decided to split from Rome, and Elizabeth is able to kind of settle that down. She's able to kind of convince everyone that this new kind of Protestant version of the English church is the right way to go, and she establishes that through various political means. And then when Elizabeth finally dies, James I comes to power. Elizabeth is also, even though she's very interested in everybody in England becoming an Anglican, becoming a member of this new Protestant church, she's also seeing some dissenting movements within her reign, and to some degree she's somewhat tolerant of these, but they emerge, certainly during her rule. And then the next king that comes along, James I, a little bit less tolerant of those dissenters, and that's actually one of the things that kind of pushes some of these groups to come to what is emerging as the American colonial system. Okay. King James also, he famously hires a bunch of people to translate the Bible into English in a definitive way, and that becomes the famous King James Bible. Okay, so what they establish in England is something called the Anglican Church, which is a church that looks still kind of like a lot of the medieval Catholic tradition. It has bishops, it has priests, it practices elaborate rituals called the sacraments. Other Protestants had rejected a lot of those sacraments. But it, by and large, justifies, rationalizes, understands these elements using Protestant theology, using the ideas that Luther, Calvin, and some other people had developed. Okay? So one of the things, for example, they do is they develop the Book of Common Prayer, English language worship book that becomes, in some sense, the beloved book of the Anglican and later Episcopalian tradition. Okay, and so what happens at the same, as the Anglican Church is sort of establishing itself, establishing its authority in English society, there are people that just don't agree for lots of complicated reasons. By and large, the dissenters don't agree with the church because, at least these dissenters don't agree with the church because they don't think it has gone far enough away from Catholicism. There's still some English Catholics that hang around, but by and large, there are the Anglicans who are sort of happy with the way things are, happy with what's been established. But then there's other Protestant groups that are going to say, we need to go farther. We haven't gone far enough. We're still too Catholic-like or Catholic-looking, okay? And there's two basic flavors of these dissenters. One are groups that basically say, well, we don't like the way things are, but we think, and we want to push for more reforms, more changes, But we think we need to stay connected to the parent church because otherwise we're going to have no leverage, right? So we've got to stay connected, and we will try to sustain our reform effort while still staying in contact and staying in contact with the Anglican Church. And these include the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists. And then there are separatists that basically say things are just too bad, right? The Anglican Church is just too corrupt. It's hung on to too many of those things that we see are not viable anymore for Christian worship, and therefore we need to form independent, autonomous religious organizations. These include the Baptists and the Quakers, and there's some other of these dissenting groups too, but these are the big ones. And of course, why is this a good thing to talk about in American context of American colonial system? Well, if you look, these are all the groups that come over to the United States, right? So these are the groups that really become the foundational groups in the U.S. Okay, in general, the dissenting groups were very influenced by the reformer John Calvin, and they had a lot of his views about things like faith and predestination and the sinfulness of human beings. They were very ardently anti-Catholic. They really disliked the Catholics, and they liked a kind of a strict form of worship, a strict form of kind of social discipline as well. And so a lot of the, if you will, the kind of the notorious sort of strictness and severity of early New England, in some sense, is connected to this sort of adoption of Calvinist ideals. In Adam's, well, this is the reader. This is what they taught their kids with, right? In Adam's fall, we sinned all. Thy life to mend, this book attend. The idle fool is whipped at school. Okay, and so the United States forms in this context. So it's basically, we're talking about, the colonial English colonies form in this context, and we're talking about the eastern seaboard colonies that formed starting in the 17th century. And at the time, the French and the Spanish were also active in the New World, and so there were lots of different motives behind these colonies. Part of it was kind of geopolitical, right? The English didn't want to see their rivals, the French and the Spanish, who were, by the way, were still Catholics, get all of the New World. But there were also economic motives. So a lot of the early colonies were founded by what essentially were corporations, right? They were founded to make some money. But then there were also clearly religious motives. The Protestants wanted to get a foothold in the New World. They wanted a place maybe where some of these dissenting groups could experiment or find some freedom. And then they also wanted to convert some of the native peoples that they encountered in the New World. And eventually they will set up various missions and schools and things like that to try to do that. See how I'm doing. Okay. All right. So New England, in some sense, is the place where one form of the dissenting, non-separating dissenting Calvinists come, and that's the Congregationalists. And it's established in and around Boston. And it's very much steeped in Calvinism. And so this, those of you who are familiar with the history of Massachusetts are familiar with a lot of the ideals that govern this early society. It was very much kind of built on almost a utopian ideal. So we're going to create this perfect Calvinist Protestant society. It is going to be a beacon for other forms of Christianity. They're going to see how good it is once we've built this up. It is going to be a unique and distinctive experiment that will show the rest of the world what right living is all about. Okay, so it had high ideals, high aspirations, built around various different theological ideas. Theocratically, though, it was very strict. And so one of the things that characterized this society is that people who had different views, or people that at least voiced different views, or those views became apparent to the leadership, were oftentimes punished or put on trial, or sometimes kicked out of the society, and in a few instances were even executed. Okay, so it was really kind of severe with its dissenters. And so in some sense, going from a dissenting position in England to being in charge in this colony, these leaders basically said, you know, we had it right? We were right, and our dissent in England was based on the fact that we were correct. And we believe in religious freedom because religious freedom allows us to protect what we think is the valuable core of Christianity. But once we have gotten the ability to sort of practice that core, that sort of understanding of Christianity, we need to protect that, and therefore we need to exclude the types of Christianity, or we need to monitor or regulate very tightly those types of Christianity we think are wrong. Okay, and John Winthrop's sort of the great character there. This is just a map of where the Puritans come. They start out kind of, Boston area, but then they're also very influential in places like Connecticut and in other parts of New England. Now, the South is quite different. The southern colonies are founded by primarily Anglicans, and the Anglicans are kind of trying to bring over the British establishment. So in some sense, they have sort of the endorsement of the crown. They have the endorsement of the British system that is basically saying, this is the right form of religion. They struggle a little bit, though, because it's hard actually for the Anglicans to kind of get going in the New World. They're not always able to get the priests over here that they would like. And so they end up doing a little bit more of a kind of a self-rule styled Anglicanism. It's a little bit different than English Anglicanism. And later the Anglicans are going to become the Episcopalians after the Revolution. And then finally, we have the middle colonies, which are going to be built on a very different principle, oftentimes founded by diverse peoples, but sometimes people like William Penn, who very much took the idea of being a dissenter, had been a dissenter in England as a Quaker, and had been much discriminated against there, and kind of took that ideal and said, look, I just want to totally flip that on its head. I want to create a very different type of society that's not absolutist, that's not going to sort of insist that everyone be a Quaker, but it's going to be a society that's characterized by tolerance, that's open to different points of view, that's open to different communities coming over here with different religious points of view. Now, ever the savvy business person as well as kind of a religious reformer, William Penn realized that there weren't that many Quakers in England, and he probably wasn't going to get a very big population over to Pennsylvania. So this was kind of a shrewd business move as much as it was a kind of religious ideal. But this is something that's very characteristic of Quakers, right? So always thinking in multiple dimensions. Okay, so this gives you kind of a map of the way things are. And so up in, if I get this, it's this one. Well, up in the right-hand corner, you have in the blue the New England Puritans, which are dominated by the Congregationalists. But if you look at those other little crosses and things, there's actually a little Jewish star there too. There are some other smaller groups in New England. So even though the Puritans are dominating things and kind of ruling things kind of with a pretty tight fist, there are some other things emerging. And then in the South, you have largely Anglican leadership. However, you also see the emergence of some other religious groups. And then in the middle, you have the much more sort of complicated pluralistic model. And if you put it all together in a different way, I like this image because this is, I tell my students, this is the Lego way to do history. Okay, so imagine this is the different colonies, and each of these little squares, these little Legos, right, they represent kind of a unit of that particular type of religion in that particular colony. And in some sense, you can kind of see how the demographics kind of shape the character of these different colonies. So Connecticut and Massachusetts, the two biggest New England colonies, are clearly dominated by the Congregationalists, but they're not totally Congregationalists. They've got some other stuff there, including some Baptists. The Virginias, Virginia, the major southern colony, is dominated by the Anglicans, but if you look at New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and to some degree some of these other colonies too, you see a much more sort of diversified pluralism. And so one thing you can say is that if you've got the kind of population dominance that you see with the Congregationalists in New England, you see with the Anglicans in Virginia, those guys have enough resources, enough muscle to kind of push everybody else around religiously, right? They just have the kind of political dominance. But those middle colonies, they just don't have a group that can clearly do that, okay? And so in some sense, it becomes very natural for them, very logical, very reasonable, very rational for them to kind of have an ethos of tolerance. And to some degree, this is also based on the way that it was planned, like Pennsylvania planned from the start, that it would end up looking sort of like this. Okay, now, what happens after the American Revolution, the various colonies come together and they recognize that the Articles of Confederation aren't strong enough. They need to form a much more robust and effective national government. And once they get together and they start thinking about religious things, they realize that if you put this all together, if you took all these little Legos, put them into one big box, you're going to get something that looks a lot more like Pennsylvania or New York or New Jersey than something that looks like Virginia or Massachusetts, right? And so, in some ways, the formation of kind of the national ideal of tolerance, the national ideal of disestablishment, becomes something of an extension of the brute fact that there was so much diversity within these different Protestant groups. And by the way, there's also some Catholics, there's also some Jews at this time. But the brute fact is that the Protestant diversity kind of pushes the national government towards this position on not establishing any particular religion. Okay, so that's kind of our general story of how we got to disestablishment at the national level. Let's go back to New England and take a quick look at a case study that I think is very interesting. So if you look back at Massachusetts, for example, and you look at the green cubes, right? There's only a couple, maybe 1.5 cubes there, 1.5 Legos there. So there's a few Baptists, but there's not a whole lot, okay? And so the Baptists during this period, and really this is true all the way through, maybe 19th century, this starts changing a little bit. The Baptists are kind of a minority religion. It's hard to think that because we've got so many Baptists today. And in the United States today, the largest single Protestant denomination is a Baptist denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, right? But in Massachusetts, in the 17th, 18th century, Baptists are a little minority, and they feel very much like a minority. We disagree, and the dominant groups, they're pushing us around, and they're taking money from us, and they're doing lots of things that we don't like. And so the Baptists, at least in this context, become a really interesting example of how a minority religion works its way towards kind of acceptance and works its way towards kind of a position on religious freedom. So they descended from the Puritans. They basically disagreed from most other Christians in that they didn't think that infant baptism was a correct practice. They thought that you shouldn't get baptized until you've reached an age of reason, age where you can make a kind of a choice about becoming a Christian. So they didn't agree with infant baptism. And then they really didn't like the idea that the colony, and then later the state, would tax people to support ministers that supported a position that was supporting infant baptism, right? So there were some other ideas that they disagreed with, but these were sort of the crucial issues. And in supporting these issues, they oftentimes were very severely punished. So very famous incident, 1651, Obadiah Holmes, who was a Baptist, was caught and tried and given the choice between a fine and a public whipping, and he said, I'm going to stand on my principles. And he took the public whipping, and it was a severe whipping. He was injured for days, carried the scars for the rest of his life. Other Baptists were basically thrown out of Massachusetts. One guy was sent out to an island because he was supposedly preaching baptism, and he wasn't supposed to, so they sent him out to an island. So there's all kinds of punishments that the Baptists had to endure. But the Baptists, and this took a while, it was a slow and fairly methodical thing, but they used very, very, I would call kind of democratic, kind of principles to build their case. It took them a while, it was something that was a multi-generational effort on the part of the Baptists. But they went from being outsiders to kind of a middle level where they were kind of a tolerated minority to ultimately being socially accepted. And how did they do it? Well, they did it through petitions, public debates. They would go and debate other ministers with different views. They had their own journals. They had pamphlets. Occasionally they would practice civil disobedience, things like very conspicuously not paying their taxes. They formed coalitions with other groups that also weren't happy about the Congregationalist establishment. And so slowly, it took a long time, and there was various different levels to this, they were able to sort of build their case. Now, they weren't able to convince the Massachusetts government until the 1830s to do that. And so it is sort of interesting that even though, they were, I think, doing very sort of concerted effort, it took them a little bit longer than, let's say, the national government. But if you think about the demographic issues, in Massachusetts, they were still very much kind of a minority tradition, even well into the 1800s, okay? So the national disestablishment, 1791, New England, various states start in 1807, and in 1833 is when the Massachusetts finally does it. And the Baptists finally were able to get done, actually with the help of some other groups. There were some other groups at that time that were able to sort of work with the Baptists to finally say, to get the Massachusetts government to sort of pass amendment to its constitution to end the taxation. Okay. Okay, so kind of back to my theme again. And in general, I think, one of the things that we learned from the history of religious freedom in the colonial America and in the more restricted case, I guess I should go back and say this real quickly. In this process, this is where I guess we can bring Cape Cod in. There were definitely kind of Cape Cod Baptists that were involved in this process. So we can look at various different instances when they're doing these petitions or writing these journals or doing these things. And there are various different participants from the Cape Cod area on Cape Cod that are participating in this. Okay, so back to my general theme. Religious freedom is kind of hard to grasp. It's kind of, obviously I kind of introduced it as kind of conceptually hard to grasp, and it's kind of hard to hold too. In some ways, it really requires a sustained engagement with person and ideas that are often challenging and different. I think this is sort of maybe the heart of what I might want you to take away from this, is that in some ways, you can talk about the rationalist tradition, you can talk about the pietistic tradition, but you can also, if you think about it, they come at things very differently, and they don't completely ever quite trust each other for complicated reasons. The rationalists, in some sense, want to say, we want a more universal understanding of religion. We want to broaden the understanding of religion in a way that allows us to tolerate different diversity, different types of religions. And from the pietist point of view, that's a kind of an adulteration of a kind of a clear vision of what religion should all be about. From the pietist point of view, the rationalists are kind of taking something that should be a clear, pure vision and adulterating it or bringing in lots of other things that are maybe contrary to what they consider to be sort of that good vision, that sort of truthful vision of religion. And so, in some sense, they do have to kind of work with each other at certain times in certain places, and at least in early American history and American colonial history, they came up with the general idea that they should push for the idea of religious freedom. But it's certainly not the case that that vision has been sustained over subsequent American history. It's been very powerful, and it's more or less held together. But there have been lots and lots of other kind of twists and turns, ups and downs to the story of American religious freedom. And I'm trying to think, how am I doing for time? Yeah, let me do this real quick. I think I can do this real quick. In the 19th century, so I'll just give you a quick history. These are all maybe topics for another day. In the 19th century, there was a lot of debate over the emergence of other religions that were outside of the Protestant tradition, particularly the growth of Catholicism. Starting in the 1830s, 1840s, lots and lots of Catholics start coming over. And this is very, very disturbing to the Protestants because in some sense they were born out of this protest or this movement away from the Catholic tradition. And so there was a lot of discrimination, a lot of prejudice against those Catholics. Likewise, as Judaism starts growing, it's a complicated tradition, and there's complicated relationships that Judaism has with the American mainstream, and including the emergence of prejudice against Jews. There's a big debate over the role of religion in education. As the public education system grows over the 19th century, it's largely controlled by Protestants who, in some ways, want to make sure that it stays Protestant in its character, and oftentimes even use it to kind of inflect a little bit against Roman Catholicism. Eventually, the Roman Catholics are going to see this as such an affront that they're going to create their own education system. They're going to create the parochial school system kind of as a way to kind of protect their children from what's perceived to be a Protestant bias in public education. So there's a lot of debate over that. Very interestingly, in the end of the 19th century, we have really interesting cases where you get the emergence of new religious groups. The Mormons start in the 1820s, grow very rapidly over the course of the 19th century, move out to Utah, and of course they're very controversial because they practice something called plural marriage, men having multiple wives. And this becomes one of the biggest cases of religious freedom in the 19th century, and ultimately it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically says, well, we need to distinguish between ideas and actions, thoughts and practices. Ideas and thoughts are absolutely free. So any Mormon can believe very deeply that Joseph Smith allows them to have multiple wives. But when it comes to practice, when it comes to the actual putting that into practice, the government can regulate that. The government has every right to regulate that. So it's called the thought-action distinction in First Amendment law. Okay, you get some other controversies with religious groups, smaller religious groups and cults. The 20th and 21st century is interesting because the government really is going to grow to become enormously influential in more and more places in American life. The Progressive period, the New Deal, all throughout the 20th century, and in some ways it's going to be more involved in things that impact or interact with religion. And the Supreme Court is going to get very involved in First Amendment cases, religion cases. To some degree, their concern is going to be protecting the rights of smaller groups. It becomes very interested in that, particularly in the mid part of the century. It's also going to be interested in keeping the government from getting too entangled in religion. So there's a lot of cases that sort of have to do with that. And then in more recent decades, it's gotten interested in perhaps allowing a little bit more of an accommodative stance to religion. So it's kind of recognizing, well, if religion can do certain things that are for the social good, shouldn't they have the opportunity to do that and even use government funds to do that? So some of the cases have been ruled in that way. And then most interesting, very interesting recently, there's been a lot of debate over who or what has religious rights, including a very, very important case recently that has sort of made the argument that even a corporation may be at some level has religious rights. And that was sort of a new and different sort of direction of American religious freedom.